Welcome back to The Wandering Naturalist. In our last segment, we talked to Tim Reese of Galewoods Farm, and he talked about his personal experience with his honeybees on the farm and why they're so important, what he's doing to help make sure that he can more consistently have them survive so that it's not such a challenge having bees and pollinating his crops. Today, we have another special guest, and Angela, since you know her so well, I'm going to have you introduce her.
Yeah, so we have with us Britt Forsberg, who is here to give us more details on native pollinators and what we know here in Minnesota, which is more thanks to a fun citizen science project that I got to meet Britt and work with. So there are so many things we can do at home, and she's also going to share some of those things too. So what we can do at home to participate and promote native bees. So welcome, Britt. Can you explain a little bit about what you do at Extension and a little bit about that Native Bee Atlas?
Sure. The Native Bee Atlas is a 4-year research project funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. So we have citizen scientist volunteers across the state who are helping us gather data on what bees we have and where they live. We don't have a very complete state species list. We don't have a list that's up to date currently. So we have volunteers who are helping us learn about native stem nesting bees, bumblebees, and then we have a super easy way for anybody to share their pictures where you don't have to know what the bee is, and other users will help you identify it. That's through iNaturalist.
Well, yeah. So I have so many numbers in my head from bumblebees, bees, native bees. So how many bees do we think we have here in Minnesota?
We think there are about 400 different species.
And there's 7 families of bees?
There are 7 families worldwide. We have 6 of them in Minnesota.
6, okay.
There's one that it only lives in Australia.
Oh.
So what are the 6 families that we have then?
Oh, gosh.
If you can, not to put you on the spot,
Yeah,
but I'm curious
right?
now, because I think I know like 3 or 4 maybe.
Apidae, that includes the honeybees and bumblebees.
Okay.
Halictidae, the sweat bees. Andrenidae, these are mostly early season bees. Melicylidae. Melididae. I feel like that's not right. That's the one that we have like 2 species.
Something
and
a
you never
day.
see them, right? If I write them down, I'm much better at this. Oh, and Coletidae.
Oh, yeah.
I only had like one of those.
Epidae?
That's amazing. Okay.
Yeah, if you asked me how many I knew before I had this job, that'd be a very different list.
Yeah.
I suppose.
So what is your job title? You're program coordinator? And what does that entail?
Yeah, so it's kind of a catch-all title. I'm the one full-time employee on the Bee Atlas. We also have entomologists who help with some of the protocols and identification. We have a webmaster who helps with our database and the public website. But as program coordinator, I get to do a lot of the really fun things. I get to work with volunteers, find people across the state to help, support them, communicate with them along the way, do all the outreach. But sometimes it's really boring things like labeling boxes and mailing them.
Or super gluing tubes onto a box.
Yeah, once a year we have to glue 30
Blocks.
test tubes on each bee block. This year we had 140 bee blocks,
That's a
so
lot of super glue.
it takes
I hope
quite
you
a
had
while.
good ventilation.
So can you explain a little bit about what the bee blocks are? Because I think this is something that we're seeing more and more in like hardware stores or online and people putting in their yards. So what is a bee block?
Yeah, they're really getting popular. They're a way to provide an artificial nesting place for some of these stem nesting bees. Normally, they'd be looking for stems in plants, sometimes the holes in rotting wood left by wood-boring beetles. But I have seen stem nesting bees and stem nesting wasps just in the cracks of the foundation of my house. Colleagues
Yep.
have seen them in the hose to their or the propane hose to their gas grill, looking just for a small, narrow space where they can lay their eggs. So these bee blocks are pieces of 4x6 lumber with 30 holes drilled in them, big holes for big bees and little holes for little bees. We put them out at the beginning of the season when the adult bees will come and lay their eggs. They are using materials like mud, grass, chewed leaves. Sometimes they cut out entire round circles of leaves. So they'll start at the back of the hole, put a little ball of pollen and nectar, lay an egg on it, and then seal that off. So each of their offspring have their own room, which is something I would have killed for as a kid. Right? They will keep doing that all the way to the front of that narrow tube. Seal it off with a thicker layer of whatever material they were using, and sometimes start on another tube.
So I've heard too that So we're talking about like the orchard bee as an example of doing this. And I have a really cool video that we're going to share on our Facebook page that is just phenomenal to see this process. But I've heard that they lay the males in the front?
They do lay the males in the front.
Why would they do that?
The females are at the back. Bees can control if they lay a male egg or a female egg based on if they fertilize it or not. So the males and females actually have different numbers of chromosomes, which is really hard to wrap your brain around when we're used to humans.
Well, and what seems weird to me at least is my understanding, at least for honeybees, I don't know if it's true for other bees, it's the unfertilized egg that becomes a male. And so it's purely the queen's genetic material that's making a male, correct?
Yes.
But the queen is a female.
I know. They call it haplodiploidy.
That is, I don't know, it's just one of the things that is so confusing to me. Like, it's amazing, but it's confusing, too, to think about how she's only using her own genetic material, but she's making males. But when she combines her genetic material with the genetic material of another male, then she's making females. It seems backwards.
There are no sci-fi movies that are any weirder than the insect world.
That's true, and I do love sci-fi, but, it's...
So why would the males be in the front?
The males have a slightly shorter development time. So you think about the females are in there longer, and they take a little longer. So that means that the males who take a shorter amount of time have already left the front, so the females aren't trapped in the back.
And aren't the females maybe a little bit more important, too?
Yeah,
He said it.
I know. I felt like I should, yeah. Because, I mean, if you have one female surviving 10 males, it doesn't do you very much good. But if you have one male bee surviving 10 females, your chances of laying more eggs are a lot better for your species.
Exactly. When the females are the only ones who contribute to reproduction that way, they become more valuable, more likely that your genes will continue into the next generation and beyond.
So does having the females farther back in the tube keep them a little bit safer from predators?
Yep, there are all sorts of insects and other animals who'd love to come to this bee buffet. Woodpeckers, squirrels will eat the bees towards the outside. They're more likely to get parasitized by kleptoparasitic bees or by parasitic wasps and other insects.
Wow. So again, back to the whole purpose of driving these surveys was that there wasn't a lot known in Minnesota about the bees. And I had read something about like in the early 1900s, someone had started to do this work and didn't finish or didn't get a complete list. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of that what initiated it and where are we now?
Sure. So that study was started in 1919 and it covered 6 counties. So it didn't cover all the different habitat types that we have in Minnesota.
Which is pretty diverse here.
Right. And it's hard to go out and find some of these solitary bees. When they're small, they live by themselves. They're not in a colony like honeybees or bumblebees are. And often they're only active for a few weeks of the year. So you really have to go to the right place at exactly the right time to find them. So through the Bee Atlas, we're able to follow all of these stem nesting bees. So normally if they make their nest in a stem or in another small hole, those eggs will stay in the nest until the next year. So they'll overwinter in that nest. We take them back to the lab and then we manipulate the temperature to give them first a period of cold to mimic Minnesota winters and then warm them up on our schedule. So those little caps that we've glued on, now we know exactly which bee came out of which hole. So we know where it was nesting. We know when it nested because our volunteers have kept track of that information. We know exactly what kind of bee it is. So we're able to fill in a lot of those gaps. The other thing about our bumblebee routes is that we've spaced them pretty evenly across the state so we can find places that research hasn't been done. We get a lot of bumblebee records across the country in places where people spend more time. Bumblebees are big. They're easy to see. They have pretty distinctive color patterns, and so they're fairly easy to identify.
And there's less of them. There's only like 20 in Minnesota, so that's more approachable.
Right. So, but by going to these different places where we may not have had people looking before, we're able to fill in some of those gaps.
And just the range of where they are. Because I imagine there's some bumblebees and certain species of other bees that we only see in northern Minnesota because it is so different than southern Minnesota.
Correct. We have one bumblebee species that was found in the University of Minnesota insect collection. We have one record, Bombus frigidus. No one had spotted it recently. We weren't sure if it was still here, but by having people go out and look for them, this record in particular came through Bumblebee Watch, which is a photo program run by the Xerces Society.
And that, I think, you just take a picture of a bumblebee and people can help you identify it if you can't, correct?
Yeah, so on Bumblebee Watch, they have a panel of their own experts who do add those identifications. So, and these are people to remember that they're not getting paid. They have lives, they have other research, and so you don't get often an immediate response. But they are all highly qualified people, and so you know if someone on Bumblebee Watch has told you the species of your bumblebee, that you can be sure that's what it is.
So there's lots of ways people can participate in this citizen science. What else can people do at home to help our native bees, and these solitary bees especially?
If you think about it, bees are like any other animal. They need food to eat. They need a safe place to live. So you can help them by providing them floral resources. Think about plants that have the pollen and nectar that the bees are using for energy and to provide for their offspring. Sometimes plants you buy at the store aren't always great for that. You can buy red bee balm, but red is not a color that bees see very well, and so they're less likely to be attracted to it. Or once we have bred our roses now to have tons and tons of petals, they're beautiful to us as people, but bees can't see the inside. They can't find where the pollen and nectar are. Or sometimes those cultivars even lose the ability to produce nectar or have less pollen or pollen that's less nutritious. So by growing native plants, you're providing a healthy food source for your bees.
And I would imagine it's important, too, to make sure, like in your yard, you have something blooming at all times, because you mentioned how some of these have a really short window of time. So if they come out and that happens to be, you don't have anything in your garden at that time, they don't have that source of nectar.
Right, but there are a lot of plants that sometimes surprise us because their flowers don't look pretty or showy like what we think of sure things. So in spring, there are a lot of bees who are attracted to maple flowers. The other thing that we don't notice is maple flowers are so high off the ground a lot of the time that we don't even know there are bees there unless you're really looking for them.
Yeah, so not just flowers, but tree and shrubs play an important role too, especially maybe for that early season when you don't have a ton of flowers blooming in your garden.
Yeah, it's kind of zoom out and think of the big picture of what you're providing.
And anything we can do for like nesting?
Yeah, so about 70% of the native bee species are ground nesters. So they will dig a hole, and then just like the stem nesting bees in the bee blocks, they will lay an egg by itself, seal that off, and keep doing that throughout their tunnel. But they don't dig very well through like thick grassy areas. They can't dig through wood chip mulch. If you think about it, these are tiny little creatures, right? A piece of mulch is 15 times the size, maybe. So leaving some bare ground for this. And sometimes that's even just the space in between your plants.
Yeah, you're not asking for like a big, huge patch of ugly dirt as people see it, but just a little area here and there.
Yep. Or in my house, sometimes I see them sort of the edge between a garden and the lawn. You know, they can really, if you've given them space, they'll find it.
And I think it's worth noting, too, that a lot of these solitary bees can't sting. And so you're not going to be putting your kids at danger if you have little patches of dirt for these bees to be here.
Right. So solitary bees, the females will all have stingers, just like all the female honeybees, all the female bumblebees. But when they're very tiny bees, a lot of times their stinger is not strong enough to break human skin. I've been stung before in the lab, and it really just feels like a small poke.
Okay.
What was that?
Yeah. They also usually have less venom. At the very least, it's a different kind of venom. I wish that there were more information on this, and so I've been trying to cobble it together kind of from the literature, talking to allergists. When someone is diagnosed as having a bee allergy, it's a honeybee allergy, because the only way they can test that is if they get a sample of the venom and test that on and see how you react. And it's impossible to go and find enough solitary bees to squeeze out enough venom to do that allergy test.
Okay.
Those would be like thousands.
Right. Wow. You might get one tiny drop from each bee.
Fascinating. I didn't know that.
I didn't either. That's awesome. If I am going to put like up a bee box, what is the best time of year to hang that up, and should it be facing any certain directions?
It's great to get it up at the very beginning of the season. So if you're
What's
putting
the
up
season?
in March.
Okay.
Yep. So then mason bees are one of the very first bees that will come out. They're pretty cold tolerant. They've actually overwintered as they're pre-adults. They're mostly completed their development in their pupa. So they can quickly, as soon as it warms up, come out. And I see them normally the middle of April. Last year, of course, it was 3-ish weeks later, but we also had 15 inches of snow in St. Paul in the middle of April.
Yeah, 2018 was a weird winter.
So putting up early so that as soon as bees are emerging, they have a place to go. And something to keep in mind is that a lot of the places that are manufacturing these bee homes are not people who really know anything about bees.
Mm-hmm.
And so you find a lot of them that maybe if they use bamboo, you can see all the way through where the bees need some sort of back to be the end of their nest. Sometimes they're made out of cedar, which has the natural oils that are insecticides. So that's not a safe place to try to provide a home for your bees.
So like a pine block is probably one of the better ones, maybe?
Yeah, we make our bee blocks out of Douglas fir.
Douglas fir, okay.
But that's mostly because it's very hard to buy untreated lumber in a 4x6 piece. And so that's the only wood that we've found.
So if you're buying it, make sure it doesn't have cedar. Make sure it has a backing, or take some clay and put a backing on your bamboo.
Yep, you could totally do that.
And then does it need to face like east or south or west? It doesn't really matter.
Well, first, one other thing to keep in mind is how deep the tunnels are.
Okay.
So they should be about 4.5 to 6 inches deep. When they're really shallow, like some of the ones I've seen in stores, that's when you get only male eggs.
Okay.
Because there's not enough space to
It's
put
not
those
worth
females
it
at
to
the
risk
back.
your female eggs.
Right? So we've been recommending that once you have your setup, to have it 4 to 5 feet off the ground, and some of that is because that's where it's easiest for you to see. It's really fun to watch these change, to watch newbies come in and see when they've come out. We recommend usually facing south. So the thought on this is that then the morning sun hits them and they can warm up and get an early start on the day. So they can go out and start collecting pollen sooner.
Wow. These are great suggestions. You guys have a great website. So do you know the website address off the top of your head?
z.umn.edu/beeatlas.
There's so many amazing resources on that website. And I know it's been just an incredible experience for the Park District to, we installed these bee blocks, and the database has just been incredible for us to get information back. And there's, species accounts, so you can read about all these species and what you might be seeing in your bee blocks, with really cool pictures as well. So make sure you go check it out. And there's lots of things you can do in your yard too. So thank you, Britt, for being with us today. And hopefully we'll be seeing a report or something come along that will spell out all the results of this bee atlas and all the incredible new information we'll have for Minnesota. So thank you for all of your work.
Yeah, thanks. Three Rivers has been such a great partner, and we're really grateful to have you.
Anytime.
Well, everybody, thank you for joining us this month as we discuss different bees and their roles and why they're so important to us. I hope you enjoyed it. I always love learning more about bees, and I learned a lot talking to our guests this month.
Yeah, that was probably the fire hose method of learning things about honeybees and bumblebees because, again, they have such fascinating differences and similarities that I don't think we often connect when we're out in nature and watching them visit flowers, or we're getting a yummy honey treat in your granola or in your yogurt. We just want you to think about the importance of that honey and that honeybee, but also what that means for our wild bees and that they're equally important, if not more important.
And they're all facing challenges, whether it's from habitat loss or pesticides, herbicides.
Climate change.
Yeah, exactly. Traveling across the country from the industrialization of how we do our farming. And so, any one of these things, probably not a big deal. But again, all of these things together really creates that spiral of stress that we've talked about in so many of our podcasts and is causing a lot of scientists real concern. So much of our food comes from bees, whether it's native or it's honeybees. And I personally really like pizza. I don't want to lose it. It's great stuff.
We need to keep our tomatoes.
And so finding out solutions that we can actively do to make sure we're helping these insects so they can keep helping us with our food, whether that's planting natives in your yard, such as wild bergamot, which is the native version of red bee balm, or whether it's having some trees in your yard that have flowers like basswood or maple trees that bees love to get early nectar and pollen sources from. Those are all great things that we can do to help out on our bees. And being aware of where we're getting our flowers from. A lot of times if you go to a large chain, those flowers that you're getting that you're trying to help your bees with may have neonicotinoid pesticides in them, which will actually do more harm. If you go to a smaller garden shop or you talk to the people who run it, ask them where do they get their flowers from? Are there neonicotinoids in them or other pesticides in them you should be aware of? Because, again, that's not the one thing that's causing colony collapse disorder, but it is one of the many things it is. So the more stressors that we can remove, the healthier our populations will be.
And I think just an easy step, listening today and learning more about pollinators, raising that awareness. So there's a lot of power in knowledge and connecting everything that we eat and do in life with nature and our impacts. So with the first federally listed pollinator, the rusty patch, I think people are starting to consider the impacts this could have when it comes to lunchtime. And as we heard from Tim, honeybees play a critical role, and they're not easy to maintain, and they're facing issues as well and changing what they're doing. And then to have Britt tell us about this research that is going on to connect us to what's happening with our wild native pollinators. Is habitat restoration enough? Is citizen science going to be enough? So I think we can just all play a small role in trying to work towards that answer.
So, Angela, if people do want to learn more or get more involved, what are some ways they can do that?
Well, I would check out the Bee Lab with the University of Minnesota, which promotes diverse and healthy bees for a resilient world. A rich learning environment with many resources. And Britt mentioned that at www.beelab.umn.edu is a great resource. There's some great films out there, too. We'll post some stuff on our Facebook page. Another book that I recommend for those really curious in bumblebees, because we were just barely touching on them, is a book called Befriending Bumblebees. It's a practical guide to actually raising bumblebees.
Ooh, awesome.
Which is kind of an interesting thing. It's very difficult. And that's by Elaine Evans, Ian Burns, and Marla Spivak from the Bee Lab. And it's just a really cool, easy read book. Even if you're not going to be raising bumblebees, which most of you probably aren't, it gives you just this really cool inside look at the complexity of bumblebees.
Well, and you work on a project with Elaine Evans where you are surveying bumblebees in our park district.
Yes.
Is that a citizen science project
That is
people can
another,
get involved in?
Yeah, so there's something called the Minnesota Bumblebee Survey. There's a Facebook page and a website, so if you Google it. And so there's surveys going on across the state where the public can just show up and you don't have to know identification. So to work with bumblebees, because of the federally listing of the rusty patch, you do have to have a permit. So you can't go and do this on your own. You can take pictures and, upload them to iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch. But if you want to participate in real citizen science of catching bumblebees, I highly recommend checking them out. There's tons of dates throughout the summer, and we even have a couple at some of our parks here at Three Rivers as well.
And threeriversparks.org will list when we do those events, or at least do some of those events. Our Facebook pages will share some of the others. And it's a lot of fun to go out there and catch bumblebees and see what you caught. It's amazing how different bumblebees can look.
I highly recommend it.
Next month, we are very excited. We are doing a special edition for our podcast because it is the 50th anniversary of Lowry Nature Center.
And Crow-Hasson's Prairies.
Prairie Restoration, exactly. Two huge events, and they both tie in together really well in telling the story of the Park District, and they're both very important. Lowry was the first public nature center in the Twin Cities, and Crow-Hasson was a test bed for figuring out how do we even restore prairies. And so we're going to be telling these stories. We're excited about it. So we'll have a couple of more episodes released next month while we go into the history of the Park District, the history of Lowry, and the history of Crow-Hasson.
So if you have any questions or comments, please email us at wanderingnaturalist@threeriversparks.org.
Or check out our Facebook page. It is the Wandering Naturalist podcast of Three Rivers Park District.
Please leave us a review where you download our podcast from. Your reviews help our podcast reach other people.
A special thanks to Tom Knisely for arranging interviews for the podcast. And all of our guests today, we're really excited to have all of them here talking to us.
Keep discovering, because the more you learn and are curious about nature, the more fun your wanderings are. And we'd like to extend an invitation for all of you to join us on Saturday, September 21st for the 50th anniversary of the Restored Planted Prairies at Crow-Hasson Park Reserve. There will be horse-drawn wagon rides and so much more to celebrate 50 years of prairie restoration efforts. Brandon and I will be present at the event and leading our very own A Wandering Naturalist hike through the prairies. So again, make sure to visit threeriversparks.org for more details, and you will need to register, and we look forward to seeing you there.